Shalom and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of Parenting Through the Parsha with Rabbi Matt Shapiro.
There are certain stories that we have in our family that we tell and retell over and over again. Some of them are stories from vacations. Some of them are stories from all the way back to when our kids were born. Some of them are just stories of funny things that have happened over time. We, and I'd imagine most families, have certain things that have happened that, looking back, we laugh or reminisce or think fondly back at moments that matter from where we've been and how that resonates with where we are now. And it's not just that the stories are meaningful, but it's also sometimes interesting to reflect on if those stories have shifted over time, if there are details from the story as it actually unfolded and how we're telling it now, right? That there are ways in which it's not just the story that we tell, but it's also about how we're telling it. We start a new book this week. We start the book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy. And this book is also referred to by some commentators as Mishneh Torah, as like the second Torah, because in many ways, this book is a retelling of a lot of things that have already happened. There's not a lot of new narrative in the book of Deuteronomy. There's an important element to it in terms of it is Moses's reflection to the people about what they should be doing and remembering and thinking about as they stand poised to enter into Israel. But we're not getting a lot of new stories here. And whether that's because within the Torah itself, within that framework, we know that this is Moses' farewell speech, or depending on how you think about the Torah as a historical document, that this is a later source, that this is a later reframing of some elements of the Torah, which there seems to be historical grounding for. Either way, that we're talking here about some events that have unfolded, but they're being framed slightly differently. We're drawing a different meaning from them based on what's emphasized, based on how they're being framed within the larger context of the Torah's narrative. And there's an interesting resonance then there for me as we think about shaping identity, how we shape our identity as a family, as we think about our story, how we think about the stories that we tell our kids, that what we're emphasizing for them in terms of the narratives that they hold, that we want them to value, and also the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves. If I'm looking back and I'm seeing a story about how I might have been impatient, I can frame that story two different ways. I can tell myself that story and be like, gosh, I'm an impatient parent. I'm never able to be as patient as I want to be. Or I can look at a time when I was impatient and say, I am someone who is working on his patience. I may have not been as patient as I wanted to be in that moment, and that's something that I'm working on, and I'm better at that now, and I can be better at that in the future. The narrative that we tell is important. It's not just what happened, it's how we think about what happened. And it's interesting as well that that's actually in many ways one of the areas in our life where we have the most freedom and we have the most agency. There's a lot that happens in the world that we don't have control over. We do have at least some control over how we think about and frame and consider what has happened and the meaning that we craft around that narrative, around those events. There's a verse towards the end of the first chapter, as Moses is getting this farewell speech underway, and it offers a lovely image, and it's a relatively straightforward verse where Moses says, "In the wilderness, where you've seen that God carried you as a man carries his child, in all the ways that you walk until you came to this place, to this mountain where this narrative is unfolding," right? And it's a fairly straightforward verse, but Eliezer ben Yehuda of Worms, a Hasidic master, he notices something interesting about this verse, which is that it starts in the singular that God carried you as a man carries his child, but it ends in the plural, the whole aderech asher halachtem, the whole way that you collectively walked until you came to this place. And so he picks up on that and he plays with that and he says, this is because no two miracles are the same. No two miracles are the same. It's as if some were carried and it's as if some have walked. That the experience to get to this place is slightly different for everyone. What brought us here to this moment as we're listening to this speech is a little bit different for everyone. It's not only that we can think about and reflect on the stories a little bit differently, it's also that sometimes the experience is actually different. And so then as we think about the stories that we tell, the stories that we tell ourselves, the stories that we tell as families, extrapolating that even more broadly, it's not only that we can frame those stories a little bit differently and how we think about those narratives, it's also that different people have very different experiences of the world. And so whether that's someone you're co-parenting with, whether that's making room for the experience your kid or your kids are having, those relationships are richer with the people who we care about, with the people that we love, when we remember not only that stories evolve over time and narratives can be framed differently, but also that we do experience the world differently. And so as we hold those experiences for our circles in which we're embedded, for the circles of the people that we care about, when we remember both that we have agency over our narratives and we can and should make space for thinking about the different experiences or the different ways we experience the same event differently, that deepens and enriches the relationships that we have, which helps expand our understanding of where we've been, which in turn then also helps pave the way for thinking more broadly and deeply about where we might be going.
You have been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast site or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information about Temple Beth Am Los Angeles, go to tbala.org.